Patterns of multiplicity and uniqueness in a multilingual world, through which I seek to explore the relationship between language and freedom, starting from two major concepts, that is, uniqueness and multiplicity, as they are used in several approaches in linguistics, and the directory cultural concept, that is the nomadic thought, as it is viewed by Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari in A Thousand Plateaus, and on the other hand, in a beautiful book written by Paul Zumthor, Babel ou l'Inachèvement. So in my first two parts, I will explore several directions, connectedness between multiplicity and uniqueness and freedom. And in the last part, I will explore the personalized relationship that we may have with language through literary language. So my first slide. Linguistic multiplicity and freedom. The history of Europe is defined by a permanent phenomenon of Babelization, that is a permanent confusio linguare, an inevitable multiplication of languages whose particularity has been for a long time a negative emphasis on diversity. So the Babelwand is the label under which is placed the entire cultural history of Europe until recently, when after the French Revolution we have been witnessing an obvious paradigm shift, and especially after the totalitarian regimes which imposed a negative vision, a negative interpretation of the idea of uniqueness, unique language, etc. The phenomenon of Babelization is undoubtedly interconnected with the new forms of nomadic thought, specific to our post-truth world, characterized by uprooting and rapid changes. The profound nomadism is for Gilles Deleuze and Guattari the nomadism of those who only assemble, who no longer move or imitate anything. Against the idea of linguistic universals, Deleuze and Guattari firmly reaffirmed the existence of a multitude of dialects, patois, and slangs. In this configuration, one could never allegate the existence of an ideal speaker-listener, nor of a homogeneous linguistic community. Deleuze and Guattari suggest a powerful image, metaphorical image, the image of the rhizome, which allows them to identify multiple possibilities of connectedness. The rhizome is thus a metaphorical synthesis of the relationship between language, nomadism, and freedom, which ceaselessly establishes connections between semiotic chains, organizations of power, and circumstances relative to arts, sciences, and social struggles. Hence the Deleuzian critique of the Chomskyan grammaticality, which could not account for metaphorical languages such as the literary language. Multiplicities are considered to be rhizomatic and not amenable to any structural or generative model. It is in this context that Deleuze and Guattari oppose nomadology to history being always written from a static point of view. The nomadologic perspective, on the other hand, embraces several points of view. According to linguists such as Mikhail Ustinov, far from going nowadays towards a new internet lingua franca, we are witnessing a Babelization of the online, and I quote from Mikhail Ustinov. English accounts for less than 30% of the web, and when people use social networks such as Twitter, Facebook, and the like, they use their own native languages. The internet is getting more and more Babelized, with English getting caught up by rising languages such as Spanish, Portuguese, Chinese, and Arabic, not to mention the more than 200 languages you can now find on Wikipedia. This is a paradigm shift which makes translation, to rephrase Umberto Eco, tomorrow's language of the internet. The rapid growth and development of the online translation tools is a telling sign of that evolution. Moreover, other linguists such as Nicholas Osler go so far as to affirm that English will be the last lingua franca, and that we will be witnessing the technologically enabled Babelization. The paradigm shift becomes thus obvious. But as mentioned before, multiplicity has been considered on the contrary throughout history as a wound that must be healed, as the Adamic curse. The drama of linguistic fragmentation seems to be at the core of the history of European culture, born from its vulgar tongues. Freedom was, as a consequence, for a long time associated with perfect language. Second slide. Linguistic uniqueness and freedom. In his book, The Search of the Perfect Language, Umberto Eco operates the distinction between a perfect language and a universal language, and I quote, "It is one thing to search for a language capable of mirroring the true nature of objects. It is quite another to search for the language which everyone might or ought to speak. There is nothing that rules out that a language which is perfect might be accessible only to a few, while a language that is universal might be also imperfect." A recurrent idea in this permanent search of a perfect language is that of a language made out of things themselves, a language that retains its original isomorphism with the created world. The origin of this search is to be found in St. Augustine, who had this idea of a perfect, unique language common to all people, that transcends our common possibilities of communication. European history has otherwise registered several attempts of constructing a perfect language. From the return to sacred languages such as Hebrew, to the construction of perfect languages of images, or magic languages as John Dee's alphabet, the a priori philosophical languages, or even artificial intelligence, share the same dream of building a perfect language that transcends our common possibilities of communication. Hence, there are several attempts of constructing perfect languages, starting with correspondences with music. And to give you a fascinating example, Anne-Pierre Jacques de Disney, Pasilogie ou la musique considérée comme langue universelle, tries to build a language with sounds derived from affections of the soul. And his argumentation was based on an allegedly erroneous Latin translations of Genesis, in which he detects the use of lingua instead of labium, as people first communicated with each other by emitting sounds through their lips without articulating them with their tongue. But probably the first, next slide, yes, the first systematic project for a perfect language is Dante's De Vulgari Eloquentia. A major distinction is operated by Dante from the very beginning between the natural vulgar tongues constitutive at that time of the European configuration and the universal Latin grammar. The wound of Babel is depicted by Dante as a dishonoring of the human race. Fragmentation is at the core of the Dantesque vision of the linguistic tragic fate of Europe, presupposing an inevitable and unlimited multiplication of languages due to the changeable nature of the human being after the fall. After having submitted to a severe critique this continuous splitting linguistic process, Dante investigates the possibility to construct a language more illustrious than the others, this in defense of the vulgar tongues. And he finds that poetic language is the closest to be such an illustrious language. A peculiar form of nomadism can be associated with this poetic attempt to build a perfect language, the one that Paul Zumthor calls mental nomadism, a process that he compares with the tradition of the Renaissance navigators, searching for new spaces and ultimate uprooting. Poetic language is the very expression of movement, rootlessness, and identitarian mobility. It is at the same time the perfect synthesis of the search for a perfect language, which brings me to my last part. Personal shaping of language, the search of individual freedom by means of the literary creation, in which I will focus on two directions linked to literary language, that is historicity and nomadology. Historicity with two major figures, redescription and influence, and nomadology with two major figures, spatialization of thinking and rhythm. After the major changes entailed by the French Revolution, there are numerous attempts to utterly modify the vocabulary of the private and public sphere. These attempts finally resulted in a perfect change of social paradigm. In Contingency, Irony, and Solidarity, Richard Rorty emphasizes the power of redescription in the construction of a new social paradigm. As Rorty explains, by redescribing, anything could be made to look good or bad, important or unimportant, useful or useless. I quote, "The German idealists, the French revolutionaries, and the Romantic poets had in common a dim sense that human beings whose language changed so that no longer spoke of themselves as responsible to non-human powers would thereby become a new kind of human beings." It is interesting to remark that Rorty associates revolutionaries and poets, and that redescription is thus viewed as a powerful and tempting tool for an artist. Interestingly enough, and this is a digression, Rorty remarks that Proust, in Remembrance of Things Past, had no such temptation, that is the temptation of redescription. And I quote, "Proust had no such temptation. At the end of his life, he saw himself as looking back along the temporal axis, watching colors, sounds, things, and people fall into place from the perspective of his own most recent description of them. He did not see himself as looking down upon the sequence of temporal events from above, as having ascended from a perspectival to a non-perspectival mode of description. Theory was not part of his ambition. He was a perspectivalist who did not have to worry about whether perspectivalism was a true theory." I would add to this Rortian analysis the fact that Proust had his own method of purging himself from influences from other writers, that is the method of writing pastiches. The idea of voluntary pastiche that Proust practiced and that he developed in L'Envers du Français in 1920 presupposes this type of exercise. Moreover, Rorty's remark on Proust's perspectivalism can undoubtedly be linked with the influence, thank you. So the question I will conclude on, can a writer build his own language without any trace of influence and thus achieve freedom, or on the contrary, freedom is achieved within an entanglement of influences? As Harold Bloom explains in The Anxiety of Influence, the negative connotation of the negative of influence is rather recent in literary and art history. Moreover, Bloom speaks of an interesting phenomenon that he names apophrades, the return of the dead, that could make us believe that certain poets are imitated by their predecessors. And the last slide. I would draw from all these observations the conclusion that the dynamics of literary languages presupposes a rhizomatic structure, which brings me back to Deleuze and Guattari's views on nomadic thinking. In the light of the phenomena of influence and redescription, poetic language seems to respond to the greatest extent to the ideal of nomadology as opposed to history. When literature achieves a self-referential character, all that remains is a multitude of experimental languages whose shapes depend entirely on interpretation. From a perspectivist point of view, simultaneity seems to be the peculiarity of this type of nomadic thinking, that is, the distortion of the diachronic dimension of temporality by means of the imagination. Literary language has undoubtedly an implosive structure with the infinite capacity of generating new interpretation. It is the territory where the multi-layered structure of words becomes obvious. The phenomenon of the return of the dead allows us to infer a possible nomadology of language starting from literary text, whose main characteristic would be the spatialization of understanding, which would be synonymous with the capacity of superposing layers of interpretation. This type of nomadology points at the same time to the continuum of literary languages, so the spatialization of understanding can be a nomadologic way of discussing literature, for which rhythm is a key element. but I do not have the time to develop this new element. It is rhythm as it is viewed by Henri Mechonic, that placing language at the core of human definition. Rhythm is not considered in its traditional meaning as a formal alternation of the same and the different, ordering, measure, and proportion. On the contrary, in Mechonic's view, rhythm is defined as organization of the discourse by a subject and movement of speech within writing, personal prosody, semantics of the continuum. So in conclusion, last slide. A semantics of the continuum based on the ideas of rhythm and spatialization of thinking or understanding finds entirely its place within a nomadologic approach of literary language. Moreover, these concepts possess the metaphorical potential of bringing on the same territory the dream of totality, of a perfect language, and the effervescence of multiplicity. Thank you very much.
Professor Bondor. And now, do you want to give her question? Is Professor Karina?
Here.
Thanks for that very complex meditation and on language. Language and freedom. Isn't language by definition not free? I mean, if I'm going to communicate with you, we've got to work within structures which we can't entirely recreate, otherwise we can't communicate.
Yes, that is why there is an entire reflection around history of Europe on language not being free and on searching a perfect language that attains somehow freedom. And I think the most spectacular examples of constructing perfect languages are those inspired from music, as music is considered as a universal language, maybe superior, through which we communicate something that language is not a common language. Languages are not able to communicate because they restrict somehow meaning or certain emotions or feelings that by music would be accessible to everyone.
Dante gives up the concept that there was a perfect language that was passed on, even in the Commedia, right by the end.
Yes.
And he meets Adam and Paradiso.
Yes, but in defense of vulgar, or that he calls vulgar languages, he thinks that poetic languages is the closest, maybe through its relation to music, the closest to this idea of perfect language. Of course, Dante is in favor of the idea of the Babel wound, that it was at that time the common idea that we will never be able to reconstruct the originally perfect language.
And I would like to invite the professor from Pakistan.
Very nice again. I have seen cases that excellent idea for perfect language without sound. That's it to say. Thank you.
Thank you.
Again, they're wonderful, complex ideas, beautiful way put together. Back to the question about the perfect language. Apparently, if we talk about perfect language, they are all searching for one. Can we talk about specific standard, specific criteria that would define what a perfect language is? Is there any specific criteria? Or everyone is talking about his own way of perfect language, which would fall into imperfect language and such. Anyway.
There has been a specific criteria for a long time inspired from the Bible, that is reconstruct somehow the original isomorphism with the created word, that is find somehow a total languages. Nowadays, as I have said, I think we are witnessing an obvious paradigm shift, that is a positive emphasis on Babelization and a positive emphasis on multiplicity, in which there is no such criterion. maybe in artificial intelligence you have such a criteria, or you have to calculate, or everything is based on perfect calculations and steps. Otherwise, multiplicity is the new language of Europe.
Okay, I think this time for the first presentation.